I am Lauren Summers. I'm Senior Director for Lifelong Learning and Travel at the Yale Alumni Association. Welcome to everyone. It's great to be here with you this afternoon and to introduce you to Elizabeth Nugent. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about her before I turn it over to her for our lecture today. Elizabeth Nugent is Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale. She teaches and researches on the psychology of political behavior in the Middle East, with a further focus on the effects of religion and repression. Professor Nugent holds a BA in Arabic and an MA in Arab Studies, both from Georgetown University. She received her doctorate in politics from Princeton University with a specialization in comparative politics and a focus on the Middle East. She completed her postdoctoral research fellowship with the Middle East Initiative at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And from 2007 to 2008, she served as a Fulbright Fellow in Cairo, Egypt. She's conducted fieldwork for a variety of projects in Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, and the United Arab Emirates. Her work has been published in academic venues, including American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and World Politics, as well as in the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post. Her first book, After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition, was just published in 2020 by Princeton University Press. 2020, Elizabeth, what a year to have your first book come out. We are so excited that you're here with us this afternoon. We're going to talk about the Arab Spring 10 years on. A momentous year that it was when the Arab Spring happened, and talking about it amidst another momentous time in history. So I'm delighted to welcome you and turn things over to you for our lecture today.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren. And as you mentioned, 2020 was an interesting year to have a book come out. So I'm excited to talk about my research today with such an interesting and diverse group of people. Let me share my screen. Great, and that's working. Great.
We can see it, yes.
Wonderful. And you can't see, you can just see the slides.
That's right.
Perfect, great. Well, thank you all for being here. If you're in New Haven, it's a gorgeous day outside, so I appreciate you joining. So today I'm going to be talking about, as Lauren mentioned, the Arab Spring 10 years on. My book, which I'll talk quite a bit about during this talk, started as my dissertation, and the 10-year anniversary is an interesting moment to reflect on what we've learned over the last 10 years about what happened 10 years ago. In terms of the overview of the talk, I'm going to start with an overview of the Arab Spring, and I'll preview my argument. The argument that I'm going to walk you through in this talk is the argument of the book. So if you're interested, I do hope you will check it out. And the way that this goes through the argument, we're going to start with the origins of repression. Then we're going to go through repression and polarization in Egypt and Tunisia, my two main cases. Then we'll talk about polarization during democratic transitions. And at the end, if we have some time, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about where this research is going, what I'm still trying to make sense of at this point in time. So the Arab Spring. Likely you've all heard something about this. In this photo, you might recognize the man in the black suit. That's Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali. He was the president of Tunisia from 1987 through 2011. On the right, in the bandages, is Mohamed Bouazizi. He self-immolated in December 2010 and essentially started off the Arab Spring. When we talk about the Arab Spring, it starts with his act of defiance. He was a street vendor selling fruit. He was arrested by police. His goods were confiscated for no real reason. There was a permit that was necessary that he didn't have. He also didn't have the ability to bribe the police officer, and was arrested. In defiance of police corruption, police brutality, he self-immolates, begins a number of protests begin the next day, focusing on economic corruption and police brutality, picking up on this inspiration and beginning 3 weeks of protests that lead to Ben Ali's resignation in January 2011. So this, some of you might recognize as Tahrir Square. On the left of the photo is the old campus of the American University in Cairo, which perhaps some of you have been students at or taught at. This was when the Arab Spring felt like it got really serious. When things happen in Egypt, people take notice. This was one of the main protests that happened starting on January 25th. There were 18 days of protests that forced the resignation of Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power from 1981 through 2011. Over the course of the next 4 to 6 months, there are protests in every country. Now, some of these were much smaller. They didn't quite look like this picture of Tahrir Square, but every country that we would consider the Middle East had unprecedented mass mobilization for that context. 10 years on, though, we now know that very little democratization happened as a result of these uprisings. This is an image, it's a bit dated at this point, but it's from The Economist, and you'll see there's only one democracy, and that's Tunisia. The rest of the region, for the most part, has not progressed in terms of democratic quality. Many of these countries have regressed, right? If we're thinking about Syria in particular, we've seen, for the most part, very negative outcomes or just kind of a maintenance of the status quo as a result of the Arab Spring. So this was initially my puzzle. As a doctoral student, I was interested in trying to make sense of why were there so many divergent outcomes. And I'm going to zoom in on two specific countries, the two that I mentioned in the beginning of my talk. So Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolates. Protesters, many of whom had been working on these topics for years, questions of economic instability, economic corruption, and police brutality, take advantage of this opportunity to mobilize. January 14th, Ben Ali resigns, goes to Saudi Arabia, where he will later die in exile. In Egypt, January 25th, as I mentioned, in Tahrir Square, was initially planned to be a somewhat small protest. January 25th is what's called National Police Day in Egypt. This is normally a state holiday to commemorate the positive role of the police in the Egyptian state. Protesters took this back, renamed it a protest against the police state, and 18 days later leads to the resignation of Hosni Mubarak. So initially, these two first movers were very similar in their transitions. Both of these long-ruling authoritarian presidents resigned, right? So Ben Ali had been in power since 1987, resigns, goes to Saudi Arabia. Hosni Mubarak had been in power from 1981, resigns, goes to his luxurious home on the Red Sea. In both of these cases, the former opposition is now in charge of the transition. This isn't to say that the old regime isn't present at all, but the old opposition groups who were contesting those very tightly controlled elections are, for the first time, making decisions of consequence. In addition, in both of these cases, the religious secular cleavage was salient. It was the axis of competition along which groups were competing in elections, and which was extremely central to the constitutional drafting process, which I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of the talk. And as you might know, in the Middle East, the Islamist religious cleavage is somewhat specific to the region. And then Islamists, the longstanding Islamist opposition, won the same percentage in early constituent elections, suggesting that we might have very similar transitional processes playing out in these two countries. But very quickly, it becomes clear that Egypt and Tunisia are going to have very different transitions. In Tunisia, by January 2014, a new constitution was passed. And in some ways, this was a quote unquote failure. The Constitutional Assembly was supposed to, draft a new constitution in 1 year. But doing that within 3 years with not only contributions from both secular and Islamist opposition, compromise from both sides, and agreement from both sides was no easy feat. In 3 years, to draft a constitution undoing 60 years of authoritarianism is frankly amazing. This paved the way for these second elections, both parliamentary and presidential elections. And in February 2015, we saw a transfer of power from a government that was actually led by Islamists, that Islamist group that won the 37% in early elections, to a secular government. And since then, again, I'll return to this at the end of the talk, we've seen Tunisia continue on this path towards democratic consolidation. It's not there yet, a lot of security challenges, a lot of economic challenges, but it's still on the path. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the constitutional process, the drafting process, and the way in which it gets passed is very much a heavy-handed approach where the Brotherhood, who did very well in those first elections, dominates. Secularists walk out of the constitution drafting process in November 2012, and the Brotherhood and its allies push through a constitution that doesn't have any input from the secular opposition and is also quite heavy-handed in terms of the way in which it institutionalizes religion and politics. This tension between the Brotherhood under Mohamed Morsi and the opposition facilitates a coup that happens in July 2013. If you're an Egypt follower, one of the things that really struck me about the coup was that the current president of Egypt was on stage announcing that the military would be intervening, and there were members of the secular opposition sitting behind him on stage in tacit approval. This, the coup then leads to the election of the current president of Egypt, a military president who's winning, these 95% of the vote that we would expect in very unfree, unfair authoritarian regimes. So when I started looking at all this and trying to make sense of this, I looked back at the last literature, the last wave of literature on democratic transitions. And this particular literature tends to update when big events happen. So the last time this had been updated was really around the third wave of democratization, early 90s, making sense of the fall of the Soviet Union and other aspects of democratization in Latin America. And in that literature, some of which you might have read as undergraduates at Yale, polarization is extremely important for elites and their ability to make important decisions and make important compromises during moments of transition. And as I'll show you later in the talk, Egypt and Tunisia were differently polarized in 2011 on that dimension of contestation, the Islamist secular divide. This proved to be Egypt's undoing and proved to be what facilitated Tunisia getting past those really difficult moments of democratic transition. The motivating question, in an academic sense, for the project was, why do authoritarian systems emerge more, less polarized during transitions? Quite a bit of the literature in political science focuses on polarization in a democratic context. Obviously, this is very important, but authoritarian contexts are setting the stage for their transition should they happen. So this is where I'm really focusing on in the book. When I talk about polarization, this is a term that lots of people use in lots of different ways. I am specifically talking about two aspects of it. So first, affect, the extent to which competing groups dislike each other, and preferences. So the extent to which competing groups disagree with each other. And I'm happy in the Q&A to talk a little bit about how I think these things work together. In my cases, they are trending in the same way. The groups both dislike and disagree with each other, but we can think of situations where maybe that's not the case. So existing explanations for polarization tend to focus on three aspects. So structural explanations, where there's something about the society that explains the level of polarization and explains cross-national polarization, right? The distribution between rural and urban, religious and secular. There's also strategic explanations where parties are strategically forced to deal with certain kinds of electoral systems. There's also ideological explanations where there's something about, in this case, Islamists, where they're unable to compromise with other groups. All three of these factors don't really explain what's going on in Egypt and Tunisia. And I argue that they fail to really explain these cases because they don't consider the psychological process through which preferences are formed. And here context matters. If you remember, I just mentioned how much of this literature comes from democratic context where there's some baseline level of ability to contest elections. There's generally freedom from repression. And also group identities matter. So we're not just talking about people who are coming to 2011 having to draft a new constitution for their country in a bubble, in a vacuum, right? They come with a lot of baggage, personal baggage, family baggage, and group baggage. So the spoiler, or I guess the foreshadowing of my argument is that I argue that in authoritarian context, repression conditions political polarization. How does it do this? This is my cover also, I love my cover. I had a wonderful Egyptian artist who read my book proposal and then agreed to make this cover. So I was really thrilled that he was willing to do that. Okay, so let's define a couple of terms that are central to understanding what we're going to be talking about today. So repression here, this is another term that people often use to mean a bunch of different things. I'm specifically thinking about it in authoritarian regimes. And here, academics define it as state behavior intended to demobilize actors who challenge the regime. There's a focus here, especially in my story, on physical coercive actions undertaken by the regime. Arrests, beatings, harassment, targeted assassinations, raids, tortures, disappearances, mass killings, and forced exile. There's something very important about it being a bodily experience, that it's affecting people's bodies, and that it's visible. You'll see in a second why that's important, right? So we can think about economic repression. Sometimes that works a little bit differently, where people assume they are being targeted by the regime. Here, it's very hard to know that you're not being targeted by the regime. And one thing that I think is particularly important to emphasize in the way that I'm thinking about repression is that often in academic studies, we think of repression as being a behavioral impediment, right? So something that makes certain actions more costly, other ones less costly. Here we might be assuming that the opposition actors are rational and they're trying to maximize different things. What I found in my research and what I'll show you over the course of the next 15, 20 minutes is that repression is also a visceral trauma for people, right? And who people suffer with matters for whether or not it becomes a mobilizing or a demobilizing effect. This is a quote from Christian Davenport that talks about how when we only focus on political opportunity structures, we really don't know how individuals are experiencing repression and what that might mean for their own politics. So my theory is a two-step theory. There's a lot of arrows here, but the way I see it, repression conditions identity, and identity then conditions political polarization through psychological processes. So let's break this down a little bit more. So repression conditions identities through three mechanisms. The most important one is the central mechanism of psychology. If you remember what I just said about repression being visible, the idea here is that repression reveals information to people about who's in their in-group and who's not, because they're learning through being repressed that those people are being treated differently or they're being treated similarly. Then a social mechanism is who are they literally interacting with in places of repression, in exile, in prison. The organizational mechanism focuses on how, particularly within the Egyptian cases, you'll see in a couple of slides, the way in which organizations shut down under targeted repression reifies some of these processes, really reinforces them. So the social, psychological, and organizational mechanisms work together to create certain political identities. Then through processes of group differentiation, identities create different levels of affective and preference polarization. Now here, the type of repression matters. So targeted repression through these three mechanisms is going to create a heightened in-group identity for the group under target, right? So here we're going to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. When the Muslim Brotherhood is repressed over decades under the Mubarak regime, in-group identification, that of the Brotherhood, is strengthening. Through processes of group differentiation, polarization increases. In a place like Tunisia, where we have widespread repression, here there's either, and I can't fully get at this, but there's kind of two processes that are happening. So there's both a lessening of the in-group identification. If we're thinking again about Islamists, this would be anatha. And there is a supra identity that is created that bridges across different opposition groups, here focusing on the concept of the opposition. And that in turn recreates new identity boundaries and lessens political polarization. I'm going to walk you through this argument with some more details in a couple of slides. So as I mentioned in the book, I start with the origins of repression. This was a question that always came up when I tried to compare Egypt and Tunisia. My dissertation advisors asked me this for years. Why do regimes repress differently, right? For my story to make sense, the regimes can't be repressing based on certain levels of polarization or relationships between the parties. They have to be doing this for other reasons. So most existing explanations, including by one of my really wonderful colleagues here, Milan Sfolik, is that autocrats come to power and they construct coercive institutions based on the threats that they see around them when they come to power, right? So, you know, they come to power, they see that the military is going to repress them or could rise up against them, and they create an institution that's going to take care of the military. From that moment on, right, so the autocrat comes to power, there's a path dependence in that the coercive institutions that are put in place at time zero persist. But you know, this makes sense perhaps in places where state building is happening when a leader comes to power. Leaders very rarely start from scratch, particularly in the Middle East, where these countries are gaining independence in the 1950s. There are states already in place. So what I do in the book is I go back and look at where do the coercive institutions, the institutions that actually do repressing in these regimes, where do they come from? And what I find is that the colonial period in the Middle East is particularly important for thinking about state building in the region, and particularly so when it comes to coercive institutions. So the path dependence idea, right, that institutions put in place at time zero persist is correct, but it just has to be moved back further in time. And what I find is, you know, the French-British dichotomy of polarization, of repression is not the be all end all, but here it does help to explain why Tunisia and Egypt have different repressive institutions and practices. So widespread repression, this is going to be our case of Tunisia. It was shaped by a French colonizing mission in which there was a lot of information collected, but there was this sense of, you know, collecting information in order to dominate. It created very specific kinds of coercive institutions, particularly with regards to intelligence. These French coercive institutions were good at getting a lot of information, but often had a hard time getting good information, right? So a lot of information, but very low quality. As a result, the French put in place these institutions that are more reactive. So once something happens, they're able to respond, but not before. And because there's no ability of the state to really disentangle, right, whether there's a real threat or a non-real threat, it ends up being a more violent institution. Now, in a British colonial case like Egypt, where we end up with targeted repression, the British had different kinds of interests, right? They were very much interested in stability, in keeping their economic holdings, you know, stable, secure, and this forces them to create coercive institutions that are better than the ones that the French leave in place. You know, so here we talk a lot about informants. The British relied quite a bit on informants within groups to get good intelligence. As a result, they're able to create higher quality intelligence and collect higher quality intelligence. This allows them to be preemptive, right? So going after a threat before it emerges, and ultimately being less violent because it can go after an actual threat versus a perceived threat. What I do in the book is show that these institutions that are put in place under the French and the British persist, right? There's not this breaking point in 1952 in Egypt and 1956 in Tunisia. There's very much a persistence of all of the policing and military institutions. And again, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. So what does this look like tangibly under Ben Ali and Mubarak, the two autocrats who were ousted in 2011. So in Tunisia, between 1987 and 2011, there were about 30,000 political prisoners. And I call this a widespread repressive regime because even though there were these distinct waves of repression against the opposition, they overlapped in jail, in exile. So first you have Islamists who are essentially the first victims of the regime. They do quite well in elections that were held in 1989. And over the course of the next 2 years, 8,000 to 10,000 members of the Islamist opposition, Ennahda, are arrested and jailed. Most of these men, and for the most part, we're going to be talking about male political prisoners, remain in jail through the early 2000s. In 1991, coinciding with the first Gulf War and the Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the regime starts to go after leftist parties. 1991 through 2002. Again, these people are also in jail through the early 2000s. And then starting in 1997, the regime goes after center-left parties. So here, this widespread repressive regime means that these groups are in the same spaces. They have the same treatment, even though it's happening at different times, they are being repressed very similarly. And they're starting to create bridging structures. So when you have multiple groups being affected by repression, they tend to bond together. I'll give you some more concrete examples of this in just a minute. So in contrast, Egypt also has 30,000 political prisoners. One, first comparison might suggest that this is a different experience. In Tunisia, we have about 1/8 of the population at the time of Egypt. The transitional justice campaign that I'll talk a little bit about at the end of the talk does suggest that in Tunisia, almost every family had some direct experience of repression under the previous regime. In Egypt, that's not the case. Egypt is a case of what I call targeted repression, and it was targeted during this period against the Muslim Brotherhood. It tended to happen in these 5-year waves coinciding with national elections, 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010. And it also resulted in the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were being targeted, they were treated more harshly than other groups who might be arrested. They were, for the most part, tried in military tribunals, which gives the state certain power over the outcomes. It also allows for, excuse me, longer sentences. And, the state can restrict defendants' access to family and to lawyer. So in this case, the Islamists are being treated very differently from secular opposition. They're in different spaces. Few moments there are arrests of the secular opposition. This always results in the prisoner populations being segregated. And as a result, the Muslim Brotherhood really turns in on itself, right? So this organizational mechanism that I mentioned before, you start to see the Brotherhood relying much more on loyalty as an important part of what it's doing in its mission statement. So this, if you think back to my flow chart, right, different kinds of repression result in different kinds of polarization. In Tunisia, there's really positive or relatively positive affect between the opposition in 2011, the way they spoke about each other. Excuse me. But beyond that, some of the stories that I highlight in my book, these folks would talk about, the experiences they had when they were in exile, being Muslim in France, right? They had a very specific experience wherein their children, grew up together. They were also, discriminated against together. And, an anecdote that I think demonstrates this is when I was in Tunisia, this was a new case for me. Egypt is a case I've worked on for a long time. I would ask folks like, who else should I talk to given the conversation that we just had? And people would just constantly have each other's numbers, right? So they would call up other politicians who I would have assumed they didn't have a relationship with. And in Egypt, Brotherhood people did not offer to connect me with other opposition and didn't have their contact information. So this positive affect was, demonstrable in a couple of different ways. And importantly, these relationships allowed the groups to have an agreement on the role of religion in politics prior to 2010. There are two agreements that I detail in the book in 2003 and 2005, both of which happened outside of the country in France. 70% of that document ends up being in the Constitution. So as polarization is decreasing, the opposition has an idea of what a state will look like after Ben Ali. Meanwhile, in Egypt, we see in 1981, there's actually a superfluous roundup of the opposition, and we see somewhat positive affect between the opposition at that moment. By 2011, it's extremely negative. There were a couple of very superficial moments of agreement, but it was never touching on kind of the central aspects of what a democracy in Egypt would look like. And in particular, the Muslim Brotherhood is developing a stronger and stronger preference for a very conservative notion of religion and politics. To show you this visually, this is a coding that I did of the party manifestos of Islamist and secularist groups in Egypt and Tunisia in 2011. These are the top 5 parties. You can see the distribution, right? So in Egypt, you have much more polarization than you do in Tunisia. And if you think back to my flowchart, the way that I argue that these two things are linked is through identity. And I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about what that means in this case. So in Tunisia, you see over time, starting in the mid-90s and increasing through the 2000s, the creation of a bridging identity. So, I looked both at the way in which my interlocutors spoke to me about other people, but also looked at documents that were being produced in real time. And over time, the opposition in Tunisia increasingly refers to itself as the democratic opposition, right? And this is important, right? It suggests that there are groups that are willing to work together. This picture on the left demonstrates how this manifested again. So this is a protest in, I believe, 2005 against arbitrary detention in Tunisia. If you recognize any of the folks in this picture, it's quite interesting, right? So we have a communist, we have a secularist, we have an Islamist, we even have loyal opposition sitting in the same place. And this is because arbitrary detention affected all of these groups. They were able to find agreement on this and mobilize on this. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood is strengthening its in-group identification as it's being targeted by repression again and again and again. And here, this is a picture of the Brotherhood, the defendants in one of the military tribunals that was targeted against the Muslim Brotherhood. And again, this is an in-group identity in which victimhood is very central, and it has implications for the polarization that I just showed you. I want to give you 2 anecdotes that might, give you a little bit more evidence of these things working. So first, Ali Laureath, he's the gentleman in the middle in the brown on the picture on the right. He was a high-ranking member of Ennahda in the 80s. He was arrested in 89, and he spent 15 years in solitary confinement in prison. And he would later go on to become the prime minister, the minister of the interior, very important after 2011. So this 15-year experience, he told me a very moving story in solitary confinement. If you think about the period from, 1990 through 2005, a lot of things are happening. And he described himself as a cerebral person, didn't have anyone to talk to, in addition to all the other issues that being in prison raises for him. Part of it was that he had no sense of what other people had felt about major things that had happened in the world. So the first thing, he's released from prison, 2005, he goes to his family home, and members of a secular opposition group, remember he's an Islamist, come and they sit for hours. they're sitting there talking about everything. Ali asked them about, how did the Tunisian people react to this? How did the Tunisian people react to that? And he started to feel, as a politician, this was really interesting and important to him. And he was so moved by the fact that members of, in this case, the PDP, came to his house, were talking to him with respect. The quote that I'm emphasizing here is just this sense of we were one and the same, right? They told me this as if we were sitting in their office. What I mean by this is that there was no longer anything that divided us at all. I was actually able to speak to the man who showed up there, Ahmed Shebi of the PDP, and he emphasized that very much this was a sense of we had suffered together. Now, Ahmed Shebi had not been imprisoned under Ben Ali, but he had been imprisoned under the Bourguiba regime. And so there was a sense of solidarity there that ended up being really important. Meanwhile, in Egypt, here's an anecdote that I think demonstrates how the Brotherhood started to increasingly portray themselves and feel themselves to be victims. This is a quote from a Muslim Brotherhood internal report that was circulated around 2005. There's a sense of, we have been subjected to the, quote, ugliest shades of injustice, abuse, and racism, like what happened in South Africa and America between those with white and Black skin. And this matters because they don't feel like they need to share power. They don't feel like they need to compromise with members of the secular opposition. This picture on the left is of Muslim Brotherhood leader entering court for one of the military tribunals. Excuse me. So this is all so far before 2011. The last part of the book talks about why this was important during the transition. So if you think back to the first couple of minutes of my talk, this mattered for why we end up with at least, a path towards democratic consolidation in Tunisia and authoritarian retrenchment in Egypt. So I demonstrate, through a lab experiment and also in Egypt and Tunisia, that polarization makes it really difficult for these groups to compromise and cooperate during these moments of immense consequence during democratic transitions. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there were at least 3 ways in which this was really important. So drafting a new constitution, not an easy feat under the best of circumstances, but extremely important in trying to achieve a democratic transition from an authoritarian regime. Scheduling and running first elections. So not only the rules of the game, but also the timing. There was a sense in both countries that Islamists would do really well if elections were held too early. And finally, creating a framework for transitional justice. In a case that's marked by repression, there's a sense of needing to hold accountable the old regime, but also agreeing on who the old regime was, who were the perpetrators of these crimes. We see huge divergence in this in Egypt and Tunisia. So in Tunisia, as I mentioned, the new constitution is drafted, supposed to be in a year, but within 3 years, they have a new constitution with compromise, contribution, and support from both sides. There's been a number of national elections since then. And more importantly, in 2018, Tunisia had its first post-authoritarian municipal elections, which suggests that the democratization process is now not just at the national level, it's trickling down to parts of the country outside of the capital. And finally, Tunisia had a really exemplary Truth and Dignity Commission. Running for 6 years, they collected over 60,000 complaints, wherein people could come to this commission, register their complaints against the old regime, having faced different kinds of repression, torture, etc. It's a really moving final ceremony that included nationally broadcast testimonies. And what was important about this was that as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the full so in terms of the Truth and Dignity Commission, there was a sense that almost everyone in Tunisia had had a personal experience of repression. So there wasn't a polarized sense of, this is a Islamist issue, this is a secular issue. It was really a Tunisian issue. And the nationally broadcast hearings were particularly illuminating in terms of what the state had been doing to people and how universal that experience was. Meanwhile, in Egypt, you have that constitution that's pushed through in 2012 by the Brotherhood. With the coup, it's reversed back to the 1971 constitution, which is particularly authoritarian. Initially, there was a delay in the elections, and now Sisi has been winning these national elections with this 95% that we expect of authoritarian regimes. And finally, there was no transitional justice. So in Egypt, had there been some kind of transitional justice campaign, it would have ended up being an Islamist issue. So that's where the book ends. The book ends around 2014. What I'm working on these days is kind of picking up where the book left off. The main project that I'm happy to talk about is looking at what happened to the folks that created the uprising in Egypt. Many of them are now in exile in Istanbul, in Berlin, in New York, and I'm interested in seeing how they continue to mobilize, whether they continue to mobilize, and when they're successful at influencing politics back home. In 2019, there was a really interesting set of protests around economic corruption affiliated with the regime that I'm looking at in the paper with Alexandra Siegel. I'm also looking at how the disappointment of the defeated revolution affects political behavior and drug use. Really interesting study coming out from the Population Council that allows us to see that people exposed to violence during the revolution and who consider the revolution a failure are twice as likely to be using drugs in this panel study. And finally, this has been paused somewhat due to COVID. I'm interested in Tunisia about how repression has conditioned certain kinds of political partisan identities. And so looking at whether the folks who were repressed for their political allegiances are stronger partisans now in the democratic system. So thank you. I apologize for the thing I have in my throat, but I look forward to chatting with Lauren and answering some of your questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was a fascinating presentation and so much material that you shared. So I want to give you a break for a minute because you have very valiantly made your way through presenting when you really needed to take a break. So I want to invite everyone to look into Professor Nugent's book, After Repression. I have placed a link to the book in the chat, and it is available through Princeton University Press. I think there's so many different angles on this topic to explore, and certainly we can't get to it in this kind of a short presentation format. So I really do invite you to consider more in-depth analysis from the book. And also, I am really hoping that Professor Nugent will decide to teach a short course with Yale Alumni Academy. So she has expressed that she might be interested in that if the questions today are good enough. So let's see. No, I'm just kidding. The questions, of course, are going to be excellent. But depending on her schedule and availability, we may be able to go deeper into this topic. Certainly, we can't go to Tunisia right now, although perhaps that would be something to do in a future time when it's a viable trip. We do periodically operate trips to Egypt, and I was there in Egypt in February of 2019 with a Yale group. And it really is fascinating to see, how the society functions and especially the extent to which Islamic identity is a part of just the day-to-day political life there. So that might be something as well to consider in the future. Professor Nugent is taking a group there and really being able to see on the front lines and discuss. So we have about 5 questions right now in the Q&A. We have about 20, 30 minutes for Q&A, so we should have time to get to all of your questions. And so please do feel free to put them in the Q&A box. That gives me a sense of who asked what first, so I can go in order, and we'll get to as many of the questions as we can. I want to start with my own question. I usually save my questions till last, but I think my question is a little bit of a summary question. If I understand your presentation correctly, Professor Nugent, it seems that we owe the democratic transition in Tunisia to the fact that the French were pretty bad at intelligence gathering, whereas the British were incredibly strategic and effective, and thereby sort of created a much more polarized environment because one group was highly targeted, whereas the French created an environment of cooperation and collegial experience amongst the various groups that they targeted. Is that a good summary of your thesis?
Yeah, I mean,
please tell me where I'm wrong, because I know a lot of people will want to be able to say what they heard in one or two sentences.
I think I would not go back that far and blame the French and the British. But I do.
This is what we do as Americans. We blame the French and the British for everything.
Simplify it, right? I would say, I think the main takeaway is that the different kinds of repression created certain conditions that were difficult to overcome in Egypt, and conditions that helped democratization in Tunisia. And part of that experience came from these institutions that preceded decolonization. I'll also say, repression, is something that's used across democratic and authoritarian regimes in lots of different ways. The most standard approach to repression is a targeted repressive environment. Most states try to economize when it comes to repression and using violence. So Tunisia is actually a very interesting example. You don't tend to have states that repress everybody, right? Unless we're talking about totalitarian regimes, personalistic dictators. You tend to have more of the Egyptian case in terms of the way in which it's creating divisive identities. So, friends of mine in Tunisia hate not when I do it, but when anyone does it, to say that Tunisia is this great success story. Clearly, there's been lots of challenges, but one thing that makes it very unique in the Arab world is this sense of enough repression, right, that it was actually doing its job, but not so much that it was destroying all infrastructure, as in the case of like Iraq, right, or in Saudi now. So it's some combination of like everybody's being affected and everyone's being repressed just enough that you're not completely decimating the opposition, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah, and thank you for drawing out those points, because I think it's really important to understand the principles of your theories. I want to go to one of the early questions that was asked, and I might have interrupted you to ask this one, but I thought that it would sort of become clearer as we go along. But I still do think it's worth giving you a chance to sort of really clearly define transitions. What are the sort of hallmarks of what you're speaking of as transitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So of all the Arab Spring cases, there are 4 cases that we could say credibly had a transition moment, right? So this is Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen. We actually saw leaders either resign, or in the case of Yemen, kind of resign and stick around, and in Libya, was ousted by an international intervention. So in terms of definition, a revolutionary situation occurred in most of these countries where there was, enough mobilization to challenge the regime. Whether that revolutionary situation translated into regime change had a lot to do with the military, right? Were they willing to fire on protesters? So then we either get leadership change or not, regime change or not, and that's when the transition happens. So it's kind of after the revolution or the uprising is done. We're talking about that period after regime change, where it doesn't necessarily, as we see in Egypt, have to result in a democracy, right? It could just be a new regime. So it's kind of that moment between regimes where lots of different things are possible, change is happening, there's different leadership in power. That's the moment that I'm trying to focus on.
Okay, great. Lots of questions coming in now. The Economist recently had an article on Tunisian authoritarian populist Abir Moussi. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And they suggest that he has been crusading against the pillars of democracy and appears to be a favorite in a future rerun for president. And the populace thinks of the stability of Ben Ali more than they think of the repression of Ben Ali. So it seems that Abir Moussi may have good prospects. And this person would like to know, what do you think of her and her prospects?
Yeah, it's a really interesting case. And I think it's I think Abir is a she, but
Right. Yeah, sorry.
What's been really interesting in Tunisia since the first round of elections, where you really didn't have the old regime contesting these elections, the ruling party in Tunisia, the RCD, the Constitutional Democratic Rally, I think is what its name was banned and didn't run in these early elections. So you didn't have old regime members or people even trying to harken back to the old regime in early elections. But in 2014, you have a party called Nidat Tunis that specifically forms with low-ranking bureaucrats from the RCD as a bulwark against Islamist domination. They feel like they are the only people who can, run in elections and credibly perform well. Say we're going to focus on economic prosperity and do so. In opposition to the Islamists. And it's interesting because, the high-ranking members of the RCD many of them have left the country, many of them have been somewhat held accountable by the judicial system, but these low-ranking bureaucrats were kind of, they knew how to run a state, but weren't so corrupt that they were, name recognized or whatnot. So I would say, at this moment, that one of the biggest issues for Tunisia is its economic development, undoing 60 plus years of a state-controlled economy, thinking about how do people even, go about reforming that? Do we want the state to be in charge of the economy? Do we want foreign investment? Do we want privatization? These conversations are still fairly new. And I think because of the economic challenges that people have faced in Tunisia over the last 10 years, some of which have to do with the revolution, some of which have nothing to do with the revolution, just the global economy over the last 10 years, there is this sense that even if we now have certain personal freedoms and we have competitive elections, we would also like to live a dignified life. That social justice aspect of the revolution really hasn't been fulfilled yet. And I think that's where somebody like Abir Moussa could do quite well if they are credibly putting forward a platform that people seem to think might actually work in getting getting Tunisia on path for the development that they'd like to see. What's interesting about these contexts, though, was at least initially, if when I was looking at survey data from these contexts, there is a lot of confusion, right? I mean, when you haven't had to be making these decisions about what kind of economy do you want, how much of the state do you want involved, where do you want the state involved? Do you want them to guarantee a pension? Do you want them to protect workers' rights, all these different things? It's really difficult to start having an informed opinion about that immediately. So it's interesting that, the first early period of the transition was really focused on the religion and politics aspect of it, getting the constitution up and running. And now we're starting to turn to these economic programs. And, among the opposition, there wasn't a ton of disagreement about this issue. It really was more contestation around that religious and secular line. So this is new. I mean, and the short answer is I think she could do quite well, because what people are starting to remember when they get nostalgic about the Ben Ali era is the economic prosperity relative to the last 10 years or so.
Okay, a lot of really excellent questions coming in. We're definitely going to have a fascinating discussion here over the next 20 minutes or so. Um, I want to go to Nancy's question because I think it follows the point that we've just discussed. You rightly corrected me that it was a she and not a he that I was referring to, right? And so on following on that point, Nancy wants to know what is the role of women in both countries. I mean, you did note that you were focusing on men, but of course that raises the question regarding the struggles that have been going on. What have women contributed? How do they play out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are women in both of these parties. Even the Islamist parties, there are women who are high-ranking members. Um, Women were front and center during the revolution. They were mobilizing. There are some major differences across the two cases, though. I would say this is a little bit outside my area of expertise, but I'm thinking of a professor and very good friend of mine, Hind Ahmed Zeki, who teaches just up the road at UConn. She's done some really interesting work on how state feminist projects in Egypt and Tunisia created different kinds of women's movements with implications for women's rights and the progress that's been made since 2011. So in Tunisia, there's a very progressive personal status code put in place in 1956 that actually legalizes abortion, kind of counterbalances some of the Islamic notions of less egalitarian, distribution in terms of inheritance and certain civil divorce rights that women have. And as a result, you've had women in Tunisia, legally, they have a lot more rights, right? So they're mobilizing in different ways. They're doing a lot more of the work that, third wave feminism did, focusing on like struggles within the households. In Egypt, there's less of that kind of legal infrastructure. And so you see women in Egypt really mobilizing to change laws, particularly around female genital mutilation, which is a big issue in Egypt. In both of my cases, for the most part, the men, the politicians I'm talking about have been men. There are a few really interesting prominent women during the transition in Tunisia who play really important roles. And many of them, in my story, they come in and out as being political prisoners at different times too. The Tunisian regime did not discriminate based on gender. And something I actually am working on for a separate article that didn't quite make it into the book was in Tunisia, even just, this was a very progressive personal status law that I mentioned in 1956. I mean, it's more progressive than certain Western countries, at least in terms of the actual rights written into the document. But the Tunisian government continued to be pretty misogynistic towards women in a lot of different ways. And one way that they did it was that they often punished men, right? So male political activists, by punishing their wives, right? So there was this sense of like, these women are an extension of their husband while their husband is in jail, or because their husband is being politically active, we will do something to the wife. And there's been some interesting coverage of this in the New York Times by a wonderful journalist, Carlotta Gall, talking about how, this contradiction between a really progressive personal status law and then a really regressive notion of women being this extension of their husband. So it's a great question, and I would say there's a lot of good research out there. I would recommend Professor Zeki's book for sure.
Okay, talking on the differences between Tunisia and Egypt, Jesse wants to know how much has the presence of a substantial Christian minority in Egypt, but not in Tunisia, contributed to the dynamic between the two countries when you're comparing the two countries?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in Egypt, you have, I think I saw the percentage put out there about 10%, probably at the maximum, of Coptic Christians. They have tended to concentrate in this party called the Wafd Party. It was initially this nationalist party that was helpful in dislodging the British way back when. It's been reformed and remade a number of different times, but it's the same name. So you do have Christians in politics. I think in some ways it does contribute a little bit to the high level of polarization, because you do have Christians who are very wary, right? When the Brotherhood comes into power, they are not in agreement with the kind of platform that the Brotherhood is putting forward. But I do think, that it's important, but perhaps not the only explanatory factor in terms of why we have more polarization in Egypt than in Tunisia. Coptic Christians, are very important in Egypt. They often, are in politics, they're in business, but I think a lot of the contestation still happens between practicing Muslims as the majority of the population.
Okay, we have a request for you to close the PowerPoint screen because they want to see you full screen. And I'll just say, if anybody doesn't get Professor Nugent's email and wants to contact her, you can always email us at Alumni Academy, and we'll pass along your message. So following on the presence of Coptics in Egypt, we had another person who asked basically the same question about Christianity and then had a follow-up. Could you comment on the importance of economic interests, considering that Egypt's military controls a massive share of the economy? Did that play a role in the failed transition?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question, because the idea here is, was the Egyptian military ever going to let Egypt go any other way, right? So one thing I look at in the conclusion of the book is Indonesia as a comparative case study. And what I find is that in the case of Indonesia, you have an Egyptian military, so a very politically active, economically invested military, but you have Tunisia's level of polarization because of widespread repression ahead of the transition, and you don't end up with a coup. So I think the fact that the military needs some kind of civilian partner is really important for a coup to happen. And in Egypt, you end up with that, fractured, divided contestation among the opposition that allows the military to kind of insert its foot in and kick the door open for the coup. I think that helps a little bit in explaining, how it's not just the Egyptian military was never going to let Egypt democratize. I would say the Egyptian military is also very powerful, right? They're very powerful right now, except for Mohamed Morsi for a whole year. They have had, control of the presidency. They were actually governing directly through the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces for 2 specific years, both before and after Mohamed Morsi. It's hard to come by exact numbers, but they may control between 15 to 40% of the economy. They employ a huge number of people. Conscription, that there's mandatory service requirements for men. And so it's a big player in Egypt, for sure.
And would you connect that with why the Brotherhood's attempt at a transition failed to consolidate their authority? That was another question that came.
Yeah. No, it's a super interesting question, and I feel like it's one of these things that people are now, like Egyptians themselves are thinking about, like what could we have done differently? And initially, the Brotherhood, had very direct lines of communication with the military during the early days of the transition and during the early days of the Morsi presidency. And I do think like this polarization aspect increasingly made it difficult for the Brotherhood to have any relationship with any other actor in Egypt. So yeah, I do think, I guess, one of the topics that I talk about a lot in my class and I talk about in the book as well is this idea of structured contingency. So there's some structures that, just exist differently in these 2 cases, right? The Egyptian military is not the Tunisian military, even though the Tunisian military could have performed a coup if they really wanted to, right? Any military could do that given their arms, right? The contingency part, I think, is where I'm focused on, these decisions that have to be made in certain ways to continue the democratization process. And that's where I think it was never predetermined that the military would intervene the way it did. It did because of the level of polarization and had kind of the cover of civilian oversight or civilian endorsement, I guess, because of the polarization.
Okay, interesting. I'm suppressing the urge to ask my own questions. I'm going to the next question from David, who asks, you made a control experiment. I'll just pause because, I'll give you another minute. There you go. So you kind of did a control experiment where you talked about looking at a comparison with Indonesia. And so David is asking if you compared repression and polarization in Algeria during their civil war with Tunisia, both countries having the French colonial backdrop, what would you think about the lessons that could be learned there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do talk about Algeria in the conclusion as well. My two kind of like additional comparative case studies are Algeria and Indonesia. And Algeria is interesting because, as you mentioned, it is a French colony, right? But this is where, if you remember when I was talking about the French-British breakdown, right? It doesn't do the full explanatory work that we would hope it would do because of a place like Algeria. So Algeria, because it was treated as essentially part of France, it gets ruled more closely like a British colony, if that makes sense. The presence of French settlers at such a rate and the strategic and emotional importance of Algeria means that the French essentially, govern it much more closely to the way the British do. So they're much better at collecting intelligence. They are there for longer as well. Tunisia was actually created as a buffer between Algeria and Libya. So that I think is really indicative of how the French think of Tunisia relative to Algeria. So that's all to say, Algeria ends up looking much more like Egypt, right? Where there's more targeted repression because the French invest much more in terms of the coercive institutions, in terms of the intelligence institutions. They need to protect French settlers in a way that they don't have to the same extent in Tunisia.
Mm-hmm. And that moves me to Philip's question, and he goes back to this issue of reducing all of the theory to the French versus the British, right? And he says, understanding that it can't be reduced in that way, it still seems clear that each European colonial power approached colonization differently. And I think this sort of echoes your point that, whatever you start from at zero tends to persist. So there are traces of those approaches in the post-colonial reality. And he just kind of wants you to comment on that and whether there are any books that you might recommend that address this question in an interesting way.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And even, the example of Algeria demonstrates even the same colonizers at different moments in time treat colonies very differently. So, I've been trying to figure out how to put more data to this question, and it's been somewhat difficult, but there are these interesting colonial statistical yearbooks that tend to exist for, at least in the same form, for French and British former colonies. And it shows that, at certain times, the British public cared a lot more about colonies running themselves, paying for themselves, right? Especially over time. As you get towards the end of colonization, publics don't want to be paying taxes to govern, the colony. So it's particularly interesting. One book I would recommend, I don't know if I have it on my shelf, by Sheena Greetens. It's called Dictators and Their Secret Police, I think. But Greetens, she's actually the former governor of Missouri's ex-wife. So if you're looking for the name, that's the last name. She looks at this question in South Asia, and she does some really innovative archival work showing that the experience of colonialism absolutely dictates the course of institutions that exist after independence. So I think that's the book I would recommend as kind of like the exemplary way to go about this. And it's a wonderfully written book too.
Can you say the name of it again?
Yeah, this is the name. I'm not sure what I think it's dictators and their secret police.
Okay, we'll
Maybe.
look it up.
Yeah.
See if we can there. Thank you. Philip, we will post in the chat the information about the book. Just give us a second. So let's go to the next question. Questions on ISIS from William, wondering, is there any explanation for the success of ISIS recruiting from Tunisia as compared to the other Arab Spring countries?
That's a great, hold on, I found the book. Here we go. That's a great question. So this was actually a big question when I was in Tunisia, starting my field work around 2013, 2014. That was kind of the height of ISIS recruitment for these foreign fighters. I don't fully know that I have a concrete answer, but there seems to be two things going on. So the people who seem to be, most likely to join ISIS from Tunisia were kind of two types. So they were either from the interior of the country, where one of the things that the Ben Ali regime did was develop the coastline of the country, where all the rulers had come from, where all of their cronies came from, and underdeveloped the interior of the country. That's where Mohamed Bouazizi lived. There had been protests around phosphate extraction without reinvestment in the region before 2011. And many of these young men who end up going to join ISIS come from those regions. So there's some kind of, for some people, there's this economic aspect of it. And then there's kind of this like upper middle class component of folks who ended up joining ISIS. And that seems to be perhaps more tied to the revolution, where there was this sense of like, things are getting boring, or things are not turning out the way we wanted them, right? Democracy's not as great as we thought it might be. What's like another adventure that we could be doing? Or what's another struggle we could be involved in? That seems to be a much smaller component of the group joining ISIS. The economic explanation seems to be the majority of people that were joining, but that is to say there was perhaps some linkage between, the aftermath of the revolution, some of the disappointment that it created after such high expectations for change, and some of the folks who left Tunisia to go to Syria and join ISIS.
Okay. Stephen is asking, I've heard it suggested that the democratic footprint of Tunisia being more pyramidal was also a contributing factor to the climate of democratization. Have you looked at this factor?
In terms of like demographics? Oh, okay, sorry. So like the distribution, got it. Yeah. So one thing that I do in the book, and I don't think I have slides on it, so I won't put the PowerPoint back up, is look at, the way that I refer to it in the book is the structural explanations for polarization, that somehow the underlying, composition of society would be explaining the levels of polarization. And I'm not sure that I looked at the demographics, but on a number of other, in terms of the age distribution, which I think you're referring to, in terms of some of the other characteristics, in terms of, when you start to account for spending power, income is not that different across these two cases. The religious secular components in terms of measurable aspects of survey responses is not that different. Even levels of urbanization is not that different. But in Egypt, there is a very large youth bulge, right? So it's kind of this like group of at this point, I think by World Bank standards, they're still youth, but they're under 35. They're kind of moving up, right, as they age. My understanding is that that's the case in most Arab countries, that like a good third to a half of the population is very young. And that's been part of what led to the Arab Spring, right? That there was increasing demand for certain things that used to be readily available, like government jobs, like government pensions, that kept people quiet and happier. And that as these younger folks are getting older, coming of age, having less opportunities than their parents, that seems to be where a lot of this dissatisfaction is kind of coming from.
Interesting pattern that we really saw happen across the globe during
Right.
that period of time. And we saw economic protests from young people in the UK and in Europe, and you know, I think to a lesser extent in the US, but certainly.
But there was actually, I'm forgetting what year it was, but I think it was 2012 in Wisconsin. There were signs that said things like "Walk like an Egyptian," right? So
Yeah.
I mean, there really was this really interesting between, maybe 2009, 2010 to 2013. There was a global wave of protest that was talking about a lot of similar issues. And interestingly, I saw a question about how police are treating protesters right now.
Yeah, I was going to go to that one next. That's Bill's question. Is there any cohesion amongst the protesters, and how is the Tunisian government treating them?
Yeah, I mean, this is another indicator of kind of how much work Tunisian democracy still has to go. So there have been protests about a bunch of different things, two specific waves about police brutality and then economic corruption. And I would say there's been reports that, the police are not as reformed as one would like at this moment. This was kind of what brought it up for me. What I found really interesting last year, as the Black Lives Matter protests were happening and these discussions about police brutality against certain components of the population were happening, there were not linked, but very similar protests happening in Tunisia about qualified immunity is essentially what it would translate as, right? So why are police, when they're firing on unarmed civilians in the line of duty, not being prosecuted for it? And so I think there's some really interesting cross-national links. It's not direct, right? Like they're not mobilizing or organizing together, but it's the same themes across very different contexts. And I think that's particularly interesting. Security sector reform in Tunisia is also a major challenge to the democratization process, and it's not easy, right? I mean, as we've talked about, a lot of these institutions have persisted for 100 years at least, and I think as the country is grappling with these economic issues, and they've also had some terrorist attacks over the last couple of years that's hurt their economy through the tourism industry, COVID, right? There's all these different things that are making it very difficult to do all the things that need to be done for successful democratization. And security sector reform, another one of these things that's very difficult to do under the best of circumstances. I think recently there's been some demonstration that the police are acting too much like they might have before 2011 in terms of, arresting kind of at will, perhaps using excessive violence, all these things that we would really like to see reformed in Tunisia.
Well, that gets us to, I think, the last sort of handful of questions, which addresses what the present and the future looks like. We have a question on immigration and migration in Tunisia and Egypt versus other countries. What do you see happening in that realm? How is it different between those two countries?
To those countries or from?
Both immigration into and migration from.
Yeah, so I've been increasingly looking at migration from those countries. I've had some wonderful undergraduate students here helping me code migration data. And Egypt right now is a very repressive situation. I had mentioned 30,000 political prisoners under Mubarak. There's probably closer to 60 now. There have been 110,000 people arrested since Sisi came to power. So there are a lot of political activists right now, probably 60,000 of them in jail. Those who have been able to leave either through asylum or making different choices professionally or personally and leave, have, right? And as I mentioned, they're congregating in some of these large capitals around the world. The numbers that I have seen is that these are, in the tens of thousands. in some places, particularly in Europe, where it's easier for Egyptians to get a visa. The United States is a lot more difficult to do. Other places like Turkey, it's much easier for Egyptians to kind of show up and get a visa. There are also a couple of very interesting communities of Egyptians who have left to places where Egyptians don't need visas. So South Korea, oddly enough, has been a place where there's a very small group of Egyptian expats there. Beirut, in Lebanon, which is obviously much closer. Tunisia, people tend to leave and then come back. So there's been like because French is so widely spoken in Tunisia still, there is a bit of like an exchange with France where people go and get their education, they make some money, and then they come home. So it's a little bit different. In both cases, they are, I think Egypt, though, has faced this a lot more with Sudanese migration. There's quite a large number of kind of what's called like South-South internal migration from other, crises on the continent. Particularly in Egypt, you see a lot of different kinds of refugees from different places that, it was a problem when I was living there in terms of the relationship between kind of the native population and the refugee population and the migrant population. But unfortunately, I think some of these both political, economic, and climate change crises are driving bigger waves of migrants kind of up the continent, if that makes sense.
Well, and it'll be really interesting to see how these things change or evolve post-COVID, because that's certainly going to have a huge impact on both societies. So Carol asked if you could comment on what your analysis and frame might imply for possible outcomes for future Egypt and for Iran and Syria. That's just a small question as we close out this session.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the situation in Egypt right now is not great, and it's hard to watch. I think a country that I've cared a lot about personally, in addition to my research. It's an amazing place with amazing people. I think maybe the one positive effect of the widespread repression that's happening under Sisi right now is that there does seem to be some shifting in terms of how people think about what happened, right? So in terms of reflecting on whether they should have been so harsh to the Brotherhood, or if the Brotherhood should have been so heavy-handed in its governance approach, there's really an interesting moment of reflection on, like, if we got a chance again to do this, what would it look like? And it's not everybody, right? I mean, there are a lot of feelings, there's a lot of trauma. The last decade in Egypt has been difficult, to say the least. But there is some kind of dialogue that's beginning to talk about, if this were to happen again, right? We know now that we all want a change. So what would it look like, right? What can we come to an agreement about? How could we do this better? So that's, I guess, the silver lining that I try to think of when I meet a lot of these activists for my next book project. Yeah, I mean, critically reflecting on what they individually contributed to kind of the reversal of the revolution and what they would do differently with another chance.
Well, and I want to jump in with that because Peyton has asked, what's the likelihood that the current repressive situation in Egypt will lead to another spring there?
Yeah, I mean, so this is such a good question. I'm recording my last lecture for my students of my Intro to Middle East Politics course, where we focus on the Arab Spring. And I think, I might have seen this in the questions. There have been protests over the last couple of years in places like Algeria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and even in Egypt, right? Even in really repressive Egypt right now, there were protests in 2019. There's some really interesting work that's been done suggesting that even if, the major democratic institutional change that we would have wanted to see didn't happen, people have been changed, right? So there was something magical. Walter Amherst has this really wonderful ethnography of the Egyptian revolution. this feeling of liminality, that everything is possible, and then having that shut doesn't take away, you know, all the possibility that you've been exposed to. So, you know, people are still, they won't forget those possibilities of change. And you see even younger generations who are too young to remember the revolution, you know, like kids right now, who just are even more progressive, even more out there in terms of, you know, their opposition to the regime than their older siblings and their parents. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a hopeful take, and it's maybe not as probable as one might hope, but I think there is a chance that this widespread repressive regime in Egypt, which is very different for Egypt, right? Like as I've demonstrated, it's been a targeted repressive regime. The current regime is spending a lot of money and, you know, political capital expanding its coercive apparatus to be more widespread. It might have a positive effect in terms of the cohesion created among the population, and in terms of, you know, the identities formed that could facilitate more positive change in the future.
I think we'd better let that be the note that we close on. I wanted to give you a chance to say any wrap-up points that you would like to make before we end our conversation.
No, I really appreciate this. You know, I'm sorry for my cough, but no, this was really a wonderful opportunity to talk about my book, and you know, I will very much, you know, if there's interest, I'd love to teach a course. I'd love to do more in-depth conversations on this. There's still a lot, I think, that we are still trying to figure out about what happened 10 years ago and where it's leading. And I would love to be in conversation with all of, you know, these wonderful Yale alums about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your generosity in spending this time with us. And if there was anyone who had questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to email Professor Nugent, or you can email us at alumniacademy@yale.edu, and we will pass along your message. And until our next webinar, thank you so much for attending. Thank you to Professor Nugent for an excellent talk, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.